So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christopher Adams. I'm the rector of St. Paul's College, and I welcome you to St. Paul's College. We have, over the past number of years, had events around the federal elections. I remember 2015, we had a good round circle with Andrea Rounce and a few others from the political science department, and Paul Thomas and others. And I just thought it'd be good to have a good panel discussion where we all talk informally for 5 or 10 minutes, and then open it up to Q&A. And so we just set aside an hour and a half for this. Cookies and muffins up on the side. Or I know Brian Peeler's here for the cookies. So good. Before we begin, I just want to say St. Paul's College is affiliated with the University of Manitoba, which is located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Innuak, Anishinaabe, I'm not saying that right, pardon me, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Oyate, and Dene, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we at St. Paul's College dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. My apologies for mispronouncing some of the First Nations peoples there. So we will, we have kind of an informal group, and I'm going to be MC, but also I'll be speaking a little bit about the election as well. And after me, what did we agree for the order? Malcolm would be first, Royce Koop, Mary Agnes, my friend, will be last, and I will be third, so I'll try to remember that order. So just as some introductions here, Royce Koop is a professor in the Department of Political Studies, which will soon be the Department of Political Science in the autumn, a renaming of the department back to what it was when I was at Wee Bairn. And Royce is a professor, and he's also a columnist with the Winnipeg Sun, and previously wrote op-ed pieces for the Winnipeg Free Press. So I welcome Royce to the group. Malcolm Bird is a professor associate professor at the University of Winnipeg, and a colleague of mine. He's also head of the Masters of Public Administration program, and he's been very kind to me, having me come in on the occasional lecture on polling and evaluation research. And also, Malcolm is a member of our college assembly. He comes here for peace and quiet when he leads it from the downtown atmosphere. And to my left here is Mary Agnes Welch, a friend of mine who is a senior partner, a co-owner of Probe Research, and used to be well known for her writing for the Winnipeg Free Press, and a graduate of Carleton University, right?
No, Columbia.
No? Columbia, that's right. So, and I'm Chris Adams. I'm the rector of St. Paul's College, and I'm a nil-salaried professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. So I think we've got 4 good people to comment on things. And what we'll do is I've asked people to speak for up to 10 minutes. And so each person will do their informal presentation, no slideshows. And I do want to introduce Lizzie, who's with Rogers TV. And Rogers, the old Shaw TV, are they broadcasting this right now live, or is it for later?
Not live, it's tape delayed. So
tape delayed, okay.
So the week a couple times.
Good, so you'll be able to come back on a later date and watch this. So to start off with, Dr. Malcolm Bird will give his remarks.
Right on. Do I get the microphone?
Yeah, we only have one mic. Austerity.
Perfect. Good to hear. Hi, everybody. Delighted to be here. I'm Malcolm Bird, Associate Professor at the University of Winnipeg. So the title of my comments are Canada's in Big Trouble. Thank God for Donald Trump. Some reflections on our upcoming election. Canada's in big trouble, folks. At the high economic level, we are actually getting poorer on a per capita basis. Our GDP is actually declining. Worker productivity, that is how much we're getting out of each worker, is at a standstill, leading to anemic economic growth, far behind our OECD colleagues and the United States. Significant inflation has zapped much of the purchasing power. Wages have failed to make up for this gap. Well illustrated by high food prices, massive increases in the price of rents, as well as housing, leading to homelessness, home insecurity, and promoting gross inequality amongst the Canadian population, particularly along generational or demographic lines. Remember, all of those housing gains are untaxed. Significant deficits at the federal government level, massive deficits at the provincial level, threaten the ability of our provincial governments to provide many of the components of the modern welfare state that we all value. At sort of a mid-level institutional perspective, our healthcare system is in deep trouble, deeply strained, a lack of labor, resources, and facilities. Our educational systems, despite being well-funded and mostly publicly provided, are failing to provide students with basic skills. And I see this every day as I spend most of my time helping graduate students to write coherent essays. I'm a long way from debating ideas with my students. At the private sector, we have no national champions or any real companies of any significance in the mining, forestry, agriculture, or even the manufacturing sector. Other notable failures include a collapse of the consensus for strong support for immigration in Canada, a major drug and overdose crisis, and tangible increases in crime. At the local level, a local and personal level, I've had to stop walking in downtown Winnipeg, and I no longer can take the bus to get around. Much of this is due to purposeful failures of our federal government, the liberal one, and I'd say the conservative one before it, and much of the civil service, which of course has grown by 100,000 people. The federal government has been primarily concerned with non-material issues, including bilingualism, identity politics, and climate change. Remember, folks, that Venezuela at one point was the wealthiest country in South America, and Argentina at one point was as wealthy as France. Don't think that can't happen here. Okay, don't want to be too depressing. Good thing I'm a Christian and I'm always hopeful. Now for the good part. Along comes Mr. Trump, okay, with his realist perspective on the world, geopolitics, and the economy, and his US first mantra, eliminating all of our small L Canadian liberal delusions that the world is a nice cooperative place. He has forced our federal government to take our country and its economic and material security seriously. Where have we been on our borders? Illegal drugs, Arctic security, defense more generally. Where have we been on money laundering, cybercrime, and espionage? I'm delighted that we're now talking about the Canadian manufacturing sector, particularly the auto sector. Do Canadians know that 30 years ago we made 3 million cars? And this year we'll be lucky to make 1.5 million? Our manufacturing sector in autos and other areas has been in steady decline. Or the fact that we have zero, it should open this week, liquefied natural gas facilities and limited capacity to sell our oil to non-US firms. Our number one and number two exports, oil and gas, have been actively stymied by our federal government through efforts to reduce financing, onerous regulations, and the like, leaving TMX aside, and thank God that was built, but of course built by the state for $34 billion. How exactly did we let ourselves get to a situation where 80% of our exports go to one nation? This is truly astonishing. I'm also delighted that pride in Canada has returned, as I'm seeing flags flying in my neighborhood, and people are proud to be Canadians and of our country. And this is also all thanks to Mr. Trump. Now to the election. Well, it's a two-horse race here, and I have to hand it to the Liberal Party. They truly are amazing, despite the unbelievable damage they've done to our country. They have managed to shift the leader and to shift perspectives away from the party, which of course is the key political body in our system, to their leader. And they've done this very, very effectively. I'm delighted that we are now talking about real issues. We've downplaying climate change, identity politics, et cetera, and that the Liberal Party appears to be talking about, like I said, wealth generation, oil and gas, manufacturing, et cetera. They have stopped short of saying that they will build new pipelines, and remember, any new oil pipelines or gas pipelines will have to be built by the state here. The Liberal Party, of course, is supported by older, wealthier baby boomer segments of the population, the people who have done wonderfully over the last 10 years with their houses. The Tories, in my view, are a much better choice. Their policies are focused on bread and butter issues that matter, jobs, creation of jobs, supporting the oil and gas sector, mining, etc., concerned with cost of living, housing, crime, etc. And amazingly, the Tories are appealing to a younger segment of the population who, of course, are getting shortchanged. A silver lining here is that the NDP has completely collapsed. As an orange Tory, I believe strongly in the value of a social democratically oriented party, but this party has completely abandoned working people and the material issues that they worry about. Again, obsessed with non-material issues such as identity politics and climate change. This leader who wears $5,000 suits and drives a Maserati is unable to connect with working folks. Tactically, major errors with the supply and confidence agreement with the Liberals. The Liberals took their ideas and largely took credit for it. I'm an orange Tory, and so I certainly hope that the NDP recovers its concern for the material condition of the working people. And then my last comment is that looks like the BQ is on decline. Also a good thing, for this party is only concerned about the narrow material interests of Quebec. And antithetical to the interests of Canada, all while receiving $14 billion in transfer payments. So anyways, so those are some of my thoughts. The good part about this is that in Canada we're now growing up and we're worried about real material issues that affect the well-being of regular Canadians. And I'll stop there.
Just gonna grab the mic there. You got it? I got it?
That's
Okay.
10 minutes.
Good job, Malcolm. Thanks so much. Thanks for coming to listen to us today. And so for my talk, I'm a political scientist who's interested in Canadian politics, but I try to see electoral politics in a broader scope, broader historical scope, and specifically in terms of what we call party systems. And so that's what I try to do. That's what I'm trying to do with this election. It takes kind of the fun out of watching politics, but I think it's a useful thing to do. I know that Brent in the third row here was in my party systems class last year, so he might have some commentary on what I'm saying here. There's a couple of questions that arise from the current campaign as they relate to the study of party systems, the historical development of the Canadian party system. And the first is, what kind of party system are we entering now, or what kind of system are we already in? For most of the 20th century in Canada, we did not see a regular alteration of power. So what we saw was a dominant Liberal Party. The Liberal Party, especially after the expansion of the franchise, the 1920s, was in power most of the time. Every once in a while we got a little interregnum. The Tories would come in under Borden, Diefenbaker, Mulroney, eventually Harper, but the Liberal Party was dominant. The 21st century was supposed to be different. We got early indications under the government, of Stephen Harper, that we were going to see more regular alteration of power between the party of the right, the Conservatives, and the Liberals, the party of the center-left, whatever it was. And so leading up to this election, we're very confident that that's what we were going to get. The Liberals were coming up to a loss after 3 terms. That's what you expect in a normal, healthy, functioning democracy. That's what you would think would happen. Instead, what we've seen is a short-circuiting of those expectations. It looks like the Liberals are going to win again a fourth term. Winning a fourth term should be a very hard thing to do. Governments make mistakes, they burn through goodwill, they have to be accountable for all the bad decisions, as well as the good decisions they have to make. Winning a 4th term, it should be very hard, and succession, leadership succession, should be very hard. Well, the Liberals are somehow going to pull this off. So the party system question, I think, comes from this is the 21st century going to look like the 20th? Is the Liberal Party going to dominate the 21st century as it did the 20th? Well, this is something maybe we can talk about in the question period, but I don't think so. This election isn't a normal election. Malcolm talked about the long shadow of Donald Trump. And in fact, if Kamala Harris had been elected president, it's very likely we would be cruising towards a Poilievre supermajority right now. But that being said, what is a normal election? Every election is weird in some way. And so it may be the case that Trump is gone in the next federal election, we revert back to regular alteration in power, or maybe not. There's also there's also an element of uncertainty. Part of the reason that the Liberals dominated the 20th century is because of something called the Tory syndrome. Tory syndrome is a great term written by a political scientist, George Perlin, who documented through how the 20th century the Conservatives suffered from a minority party syndrome. They lost power, and power disciplines parties. And so the more the party lost, the more they turned to infighting, the more they turned to throwing dinner rolls at each other, and it made it harder and harder for the party to get reelected. Power disciplines parties. Without it, parties turn inward, they become undisciplined, and the Tories have now been out of power for quite a while. The longer they're out of power, the harder it's going to be for them to come back. And so right now we don't know if the 21st century is going to look like the 20th century. There are indications on both sides. Second question, I think, relates to the NDP, and this relates to a bigger question about why we have this weird phenomenon in Canada that we do, and that, of course, is a strong, successful, sometimes dominant party of the center. Canadians don't often realize how unusual this is in democracies to have a successful party of the center. We have one in Japan, in Ireland. Very rare. In most modern democracies, what we have is a very familiar type of competition where we have a party of the center left, a party of the center right, and they alternate in power. We see that in Australia, we see that in the United Kingdom. In countries with similar governing and electoral institutions as Canada, that's what we tend to see. But in Canada, we have this weird phenomenon, successful party of the center. Now, for a long time, though a lot of us thought that this was going to come to an end, that eventually Canada would come into place with all these other democracies and we would get normal two-party competition. We thought we got that after the 2011 election, when the NDP actually beat the Liberals, and it looked like the NDP was going to supplant the Liberals, becoming a normal party of the center-left. But as you know, that is, Mr. Trudeau came along and that was history. What's interesting about this election is the spectacular decline of the NDP. Right now, the NDP is going to get either the worst outcome it's ever gotten in modern history, or second worst after the 1993 federal election. The question is the NDP going to survive in federal politics? And if it doesn't, are we moving to a form of two-party competition with the party of the center-right, the Conservatives, versus the Liberals, an actual party of the center-left, not an opportunistic brokerage party of the center that we had throughout modern Canadian history, but an actual Liberal party that is on the center-left. In Canadian politics, it will look very differently. It will look very different in the 21st century than it did in the 20th, if that's the case. So the NDP implosion is interesting in and of itself, but it has very big implications for what Canadian politics is going to look like moving forward. And I can maybe expand on that later on in the questions if people would like me to, but maybe I'll just leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Some that back.
You're last, right?
Yeah.
So thank you, Royce, and thank you, Malcolm. I should put a plug in that Royce has a new book on elections that he co-edited, and some of us here have written chapters on it. Just came out a few months ago, right?
But it's just coming out in a month or two.
And what's the title?
Elections in Canada.
Elections in Canada, imagine. So anyway, that's coming out in the next couple of months.
With a chapter by Chris.
On polling. And Kelly Saunders on election boundaries from Brandon University, etc. So that's coming out. Well, thank you very much for that series of observations about the party system. My observations will be more sort of scattered in terms of what I've been seeing lately. And we all know that Pierre Poilievre has gone down in the polls by 20 points, at least over the past number of months. Corey Tenike, who worked as Doug Ford's campaign director for the Progressive Conservatives, has openly said it's campaign malpractice. And so there's no love lost between some of the Ontario Progressive Conservatives and the federal Conservative campaign people, in particular Poilievre's campaign manager. So I would say that three things have been happening just on the short term. When we saw Donald Trump come in, suddenly things were changed. I know, as you mentioned, if Kamala Harris were president, I think we'd be in a different dynamic in this election. I also think if the Tories didn't perform their syndrome, eating their young after defeats, if Erin O'Toole were the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, my guess is that the Conservatives would have a shot at winning this election. I think there's a dynamic that's anti-Pierre Poilievre going on right now that Carney is able to take advantage of. I'm not saying that Poilievre has repelled all the voters, but I'm saying that is a dynamic that was somewhat hidden during the Justin Trudeau final year. I think that Justin Trudeau, there was such dislike for Justin Trudeau for a lot of the things he's been doing, and I think that the views about Poilievre, and we've seen that in some of the polls, such as David Coletto's polls prior to Christmas, that there was a view about Poilievre as not well liked. And I think now that we've got the shiny new penny of Mark Carney, suddenly the antipathy towards Poilievre has became much more visible. And this past week we've seen the advertisements for the Conservatives where Poilievre isn't to be seen. We see Stephen Harper, we see two old guys playing golf, which I don't know how that attracts swing voters, but anyway, we've seen a change in dynamic of the Conservative campaign here. So anyway, I think three things have happened since Christmas, aside from Donald Trump, is one is Justin Trudeau is gone. I think that's been a major change, of course. I think the killing of the carbon tax, which had been talked about so much repeatedly by Poilievre, suddenly first thing that Carney does as the Prime Minister is remove the carbon tax. And thirdly, the slogan of Canada is broken that we've been hearing over the past year or so. Canada is broken. This is not the time to be saying that when Canada is under attack for its sovereignty by a newly minted president. So these three things that have been really centerpieces of Poilievre's campaign suddenly have been removed. About the NDP, I think in many ways they've lost their way, and they are right now saving the furniture in this campaign. They are putting their resources not to expand into other areas. They are looking to save the seats that they currently own. And mentioning the 1993 election, many people forget that the Progressive Conservatives went down to 2 seats. Actually, they don't forget that. But what they do forget is the NDP went down to 9 seats under Audrey McLaughlin. And you need 12 seats to be in the House of Commons to be an official party in the House of Commons, to get research monies, to get staff, proper offices, and space within the House of Commons debates. Much like in Manitoba, to be an official party in our assembly, you need 4 seats, and the Liberals are down to 1, Cindy Lamoureux. So she formally is an independent, not a Liberal MLA. And the same thing if the NDP were to drop below 12 seats. So right now we're seeing Manitoba as the homeland of the CCF and the NDP. Stanley Knowles, Winnipeg Centre, was really one of the founders of the modern NDP when it transformed after the Diefenbaker landslide. So we're looking at the NDP really shrinking in this election, in part because of a strategic vote, because we've got Carney versus Poilievre do we want change or don't we want, or do we want stability against Trump? Those are the kind of the two options. And the NDP is being squeezed out of it, as is the fringe parties and others. But in Winnipeg, I'm looking at Winnipeg as being a bellwether for much of English Canada. And Winnipeg has a lot of new Canadians. You look at Winnipeg North, Kevin Lamoureux's riding, is 1/3 of that riding is Southeast Asian in ethnic background, so Filipino mostly. So we are seeing in Winnipeg a lot of dynamics that are similar to the rest of English-speaking Canada. One riding in particular to look at is Terry Dugan's riding, Winnipeg South, where we are in right now. That riding over the past 30 years has flipped every time the government has flipped to a different government, like Stephen Harper flipped to the Conservatives when it came back to the Liberals after Justin Trudeau, flipped back from the Conservatives over to the Liberals. A couple of months ago, we were all writing off Terry Dugan, saying the national polls are showing that Terry Dugan and the rest of the Liberals in Winnipeg, we were writing off Ben Carr, we were writing off a number of the other ridings, and right now, it looks like we might see 2015 all over again for some of these ridings in Winnipeg. So I'm looking at that. The other thing that I'm thinking about is some interesting races. Which ones, aside from Winnipeg South, am I watching? I think Terry Dugan, by the way, will win this riding. I wouldn't have said that 4 months ago. Winnipeg West I'm looking at, Marty Morantz against Doug Loyson. Loyson won it in 2015, but the suburbs, that's like a suburban riding. The suburbs in Canada, as well as in the United States, tend to be right of center. So we tend to look at these cities with a ring around each city, and those are the areas which have big houses. People worry about property crime. They drive their F-150s. They are conservative by their regular behavior. So I think Winnipeg West, I think will stay with the Conservatives. Other people are saying something different. A riding that I think is of interest to me at where I live, which is Elmwood-Transcona. Elmwood-Transcona is, that's Bill Blakey, that's Daniel Blakey's riding. It's kind of the heart of the CCF NDP in many ways. That riding, I think, is an interesting one because if there's a surge for the Liberals that we're seeing in some of the polls and probe research as well, if we're seeing a push for the Liberals in Winnipeg, Winnipeg, they changed in one of your polls from Christmas over until February. The Liberals moved up, I think, 20 points in Winnipeg. And I worked with Mary Agnes's folks for 20 years, and 10 years. I've never seen numbers like that changing. So when I look at Elmwood-Transcona, back to this, Leila Dance won it in the last by-election. I think Colin Reynolds had a shot at it. I think Colin Reynolds with the Conservatives, like the Conservative candidates elsewhere, not showing up for all party meetings. They aren't responding to media queries. I was asking Kevin Rollison at the Free Press today, are you able to talk to anybody? The only one he's able to talk to is Marty Morantz, the Conservative MP in Winnipeg West. So anyway, back to Elmwood-Transcona. The interesting dynamic there is it's Conservatives versus the NDP in that riding, not Liberal versus Conservatives. So if there's a resurgence for the Liberals, will those voters be pulling away from the NDP? And I think they will be pulling away from the NDP, which I think is an opportunity for the Conservatives to win Elmwood-Transcona. They did hold it under Lawrence Tote in 2011 to 2015. There is suburban sprawl. There are condominiums going up in that area. So it might be a seat to watch. The other one is Churchill, Kuwait, Aski, the northern riding in which Nikki Ashton holds. It has gone Liberal a couple of times before. Tina Keeper, the actress, some years ago won it, but that was the NDP vote splitting between Bev Desjardins, who had become an independent candidate, kicked out of the NDP caucus, and Nikki Ashton. So Keeper won it. Also, Elijah Harper won it some years ago as a Liberal up north there. So it's not for sure a safe riding, and I think it's worth watching because Rebecca Chartrand is getting a fair amount of support up there. But will the Ashton machine be able to hold that riding? So we might on election day see the NDP wiped out. Leah Kazan is challenged as well. What I think
likely will happen is 1 or 2 NDP seats will be held. I think Leah Kazan will be held, but I'm not sure about Transcona, and I'm not sure about Kuwait Naski, Kuwait. I know I'm getting those words mixed up. Just finally, I do see a huge surge in interest in this election. Many of you done advanced. How many here have done advanced voting? Wow, you see, okay, wow, a full crowd of you. So in my area, we had 4 lineups. It was a 20-minute wait. Other people have told me they had to wait for an hour. The numbers today out of Elections Canada is that over 7 million people have voted in the advanced voting. That was only 4 days of advanced voting, and that's up by 25% from the last election. So there really is a lot of interest in this election. So thanks everybody for being here, and Mary Agnes will correct everything I said incorrectly, and I will open it up for questions.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone. So I have a bit of a theory or an idea about this election that I thought I would maybe test with you folks, and it riffs a little bit off something that Malcolm said. My feeling about this election, and all I do is ask people how they're feeling, what they're thinking. All I'm interested in is the mood of the public and where the public is kind of getting information, where they're sitting on issues, what their vote drivers are. And my feeling about this election is that it's been one of the best elections we've had in Canada in my adult life, possibly. It's been the most dynamic. It's been, voters are the most engaged I've ever seen them. And I'll talk a bit more about what Chris mentioned about the advanced polls. People are making deeply thoughtful decisions. I think if you would have asked a lot of Canadians, 4 months ago, 5 months ago, what was driving their vote, they would have said anger. And I think now there's a little bit of fear driving people's votes, but I also think it is a genuine reflection on what we want Canada to be. And some of those intractable problems that, just as Malcolm said, we've genuinely left unsolved. East-west power grids, interprovincial trade, just these sort of intractable issues that are structural to Canada, our role in the world, our military, our sovereignty, all of these things we've never actually thought about, we're now thinking about as voters. And I think this election has been, I wish I could think of a less sexist word, but quite gentlemanly. I think the candidates during the debates were quite respectful and thoughtful. I thought the debates, there was some drama afterwards, but the debates themselves were really substantive. I think we haven't seen, for all of the talk of foreign interference, we won't know this for a little while probably, but there hasn't been this level of sort of negativity and cynicism that I thought we would experience in the next federal election. I think for those of us who've been watching elections, that was sort of a given. This one's going to be ugly. Poilievre he's going to be the attack dog. It's going to be nasty, and it hasn't been. This national mood has, driven largely by Trump, and I think also by Carney's presence, has sort of forced other candidates and campaigns, even at a local level, to calibrate their messaging to kind of that public mood. And the public sense, probably waning now a little bit, that we're all in this together, there's a national crisis, and we all need to look out for each other a little bit more. This could be totally Pollyanna. I could be wrong about this, but my feeling is, reading open-ended responses, talking to voters in focus groups, even in my political nerd chat groups, there's a feeling that this is kind of the election we always wish we could have, and we often don't. And voters are truly engaged. I always caution everybody obsessing over the advanced polls that advanced polls are a thing that parties drive people to. We shouldn't necessarily assume that there's going to be a high turnout just because of the advanced polls. But when was the last time in Canada you really did see lineups at polling stations? And this genuine desire to see what the heck's going to happen. And I think that's another reason this election has been such a good one, is that we really don't know what's going to happen. I think on election night, even though the Liberals have pulled ahead, although that's narrowed a little bit, There's some recent polling that may or may not come out in the next few days that show the NDP maybe gaining back some of that ground. I think elections are going to be riding by riding and really close. And it is unusual in Manitoba to be really unsure what's going to happen in 5-6 ridings. Usually we're all jaded. Oh my God, it's going to be Marty Morantz is going to win again, or Ben Carr's probably going to win again. But we really do. I think, especially as a former journalist, I'm used to a level of I kind of know how this is going to play out. This election has been one of those where we from 6 weeks ago we suddenly had no idea how this was going to play out. And one of my favorite examples of this is kind of our standard federal election tracking graph, which is very much like all the national tracking graphs. Boring, 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 line, straight line. We love the Tories, Liberals, boring, we hate them, we've hated them for months. And as soon as Trudeau resigned and Mark Carney was elected, that graph just exploded. It was a mess. It was a completely different shift. And to see Canadians remind us that elections matter, that politics matters, that things are not a given, that we make independent and surprising choices as Canadians, I think is kind of hugely hopeful. And I could be wrong about that. It could all go to in the next 3 days, I don't know. But this has been one of the best elections as a reporter that I covered, and as a pollster that I've followed, and as a political nerd that I've watched. That's
Right
it.
on.
Thanks, Mary Agnes. That's great.
I like that.
So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to a Q&A period, and I'm going to pull this thing out of this. So what we'll do is I'll walk around with the microphone, put up your hand, and then back to austerity, one microphone, then I'll run back to the table, and then we'll be able to have the panelists give their answers. So we'll, and when you do ask your question, just identify yourself, and then we'll have the panel answer. So our good dean, Dr. Delanta Fernando, who I want you to know is a worldwide expert in canola genetics, so he knows what to ask at this panel.
I'm not sure about that, Chris. My name is Delanta Fernando, the Dean of Studies, Sex and Pulse, and also full professor in the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences. Excellent talks. I have so many questions to ask, but I'm not going to do that because there's lots of people to ask questions. So I'll direct my question first to Malcolm. Malcolm, you kind of pointed to the change because of Donald Trump. Now, for me, as a researcher, I have seen challenges as opportunities. Why haven't we taken that step? We are always talking about banning this, banning that, that is of US as a US product. Rather, we try to come up with products and deal. And I think one of the best examples that you gave was the car manufacturing example. Why don't we do it? If you think about countries like Japan, who went way down due to the World War, and today, where are they, right? What happened? Because they had that challenge and they took it upon themselves and came out of it. But now this is an opportunity. Are we seeing Carney as the opportunity? He's not a politician. Donald Trump is not a politician. They are both, in some ways, businessmen. But why are we harping so much about Donald Trump as the instigator and our opportunity as Carney?
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'll just put out a few thoughts. One thing that I've marveled at over the last couple of years is the, I would say, complete and total collapse of English-Canadian identity. We are the line between Canada and the United States on sort of a personal, cultural level is declining, and I can see this. The CBC's coverage of the American election was truly astonishing. It continues to be astonishing. every time I turn on CBC, I play a game. Are they talking about the United States? And they are. The U.S. election coverage was amazing. They would they would just say, they talk about the election. They had people, it was obsession. We are obsessed with the United States. My children I can even hear discourse changes. They're talking about soda, they talk about college. So this line so anyways, that's declining. My next, just back to kind of Canada, like we just have it really good, like as a country. We've got the biggest, richest, most powerful country right next to us, an Arctic desert to the north, 2 big cold oceans to each side, lots of resources, excellent institutions. We've just had it really, really good. And I don't think we've really recognized that those things can be, the wealth level can decline. Remember, much of the economic, the manufacturing, even the oil and gas, all of that is there because of concerted state effort led by the federal government. Think of a national policy. All of the oil and gas, that's all been Hibernia, the oil sands, all of that. It's all because of activist state efforts, and we really have a very, very weak capital sector. Shared by, anyways, I won't go on, but like a bunch of cozy oligopolies that are not really that productive. So in terms of just Mr. Carney, yeah, I think people are looking to him for a savior. I don't think he will bring that. I think have a look at his book on values. He's very obsessed with climate transition issues and the intangible economy, which I don't think exists. Anyways, I'll stop talking.
Mary Agnes or Malcolm, Royce, do you have anything to add?
One thing.
Yeah,
Yep.
go ahead.
Okay. I'll answer one thing. And this is as somebody who is not in manufacturing, not in ag, just a small business owner. I am shocked how much in the last month I've heard the phrase productivity, sort of to Malcolm's point. I actually feel like we are suddenly finally talking about, I'm not entirely sure honestly what productivity means. Like I don't know what that practically, how we fix that, how we measure that, I don't quite understand it, but I can't believe how many times I've heard it, even outside of Chamber of Commerce luncheons. And to this point that this has become, as bad as this might get, an opportunity to think about manufacturing and think about why we don't have some of that stuff in Canada. How we rebuild that, how we were at the mercy of China, the United States, in the ag sector with canola, for example. Even around, and this is anecdata, but I went to an Economic Development Winnipeg roundtable, and it was very much about, oh God, how are we gonna deal with this? How does Economic Development Winnipeg deal with this? And all of the people around the table very much looked at the tariffs and this debate over Canada's economy and how we grow and our weaknesses as an opportunity. And we talked about building the East-West power grid and LNG in Canada and all of these really structural things that are nation building, but also are meant to get at just what you talked about, oh God, we haven't done this very well. This is an opportunity. And so I think I'm hearing that more, struggling to understand some of it, but I think your questions are the same things I hear. Royce?
Yeah, I agree with both points. And Malcolm said earlier, and I think it's true, that one of the hallmarks of the Justin Trudeau government was a real focus on post-materialist issues, on identity issues. Well, post-material, like being preoccupied with post-material issues, presumes that you're okay in terms of material goods. We have material growth. We have growth in the standard of living. And all of a sudden that seems to have been turned upside down. So, I think we should all know we've fallen into this mindset that we're always going to have special access to the American market. But it's the case that every few decades, the Americans go into a protectionist phase. And in fact, the most exciting, notable elections in Canadian history have always had to do with the Americans, our relationship with the Americans, with reciprocity. And so I agree, this return to material politics in Canada is maybe a bit of a corrective that we need.
Thanks, Royce. So, are there other questions?
Hey, Susan at the back.
There's so much information out there, and you don't know what's to believe and what's not to believe, so it's great to have some experts to answer our questions. I have a few questions, but because there's other people, I'll just ask one now, and if there's time, I'll ask others. But my first question that's important to me is, which of the parties, I guess mostly specifically the Liberal and the Conservative, do you feel support Indigenous people in Canada? Specifically, I'm more interested in the Manitoba Métis. Who's going to support the MMF? On the Manitoba Métis Federation page, they went and asked all the political parties a set of questions. The Liberals, they answered yes to most of them, gave information. Some of them they didn't answer exactly yes, but they were saying we're willing to work towards this. The Conservatives didn't even reply to any other questions, which is very concerning to me. And the other parties all just answered yes to every question, no additional information. So from your expert opinions, who do you think would be the best to support the Indigenous communities of Indigenous peoples of Canada, but more specifically the Manitoba Métis Federation and everything that's they're working towards?
Then, as I walk up to the table, I'll just take a stab at that. I was just on the phone with Kathleen from APTN, the Aboriginal People's Television Network, and she was raising the story about there's an Aboriginal People's Party that's being created down east, and she was asking about that. And I think the fact of this party being created is an indication that in this election we've heard very little about reconciliation. We've heard nothing about drinking water issues and things like that. I know in the local ridings it'll be brought up, but I would say that it's really been a backseat. I would say the party with historically the strongest record has been the NDP, and in part because the NDP has been closer to the First Nations communities and its areas of base of support, like Northern Ontario, much of the prairies, the Northern Territories. But the Liberals at times have been a little bit attuned to these issues as well. But the fact of an Aboriginal or a First Nations People's Party being created this time around is an indication that it's been an issue that's not been at the forefront. But anyway, that's my area. But I would say historically, I would say the NDP has been stronger on these issues, and the Liberals uneven up and down.
I think that's a great question. And I actually, when we look at our data, Métis people tend to vote Liberal quite consistently when we're looking at sort of identity crosstabs. First Nations folks maybe tend towards the NDP a little bit more, not always, not homogeneously, but generally. One thing, and the MMF itself has always been, even as a reporter I knew this, and now very closely aligned to the Liberals. The one thing I might suggest, though, is right now in Manitoba, the MMF is so powerful and has so much money and is doing so much stuff that it almost doesn't matter who's in government federally. The MMF is now at the point as an Indigenous government to set its own agenda, and if you want to, you got to deal with David Chartrand if you want to get anything done in the downtown currently, in a lot of other parts of the province, in Selkirk, in a lot of other parts, and so I wonder if you are a member of the Métis Nation, if you hold the cards in some ways as a voter and as a member of that organization. That would just be my, I think probably the Liberals would be naturally just much more friendly to the MMF, but I think, the MMF can set that agenda much more than a political party can at this point, more so than almost, I would say, any other Indigenous organization in the country.
All valid points. I don't have anything to add.
Yeah.
And Donna Brown, I should say Dr. Donna Brown, who just recently completed her PhD and successfully defended. Donna, over to you.
Donna Brown, Research Fellow, St. Paul's College. In addition to having a PhD in religion, I actually have a master's in economics and used to work as an economist. So it's natural for me to look at fiscal promises from the parties. It's interesting that both of the two major parties are promising massive amounts of spending and tax cuts, and nobody is discussing fiscal responsibility in either party. Yet both are trying to appeal to younger generations who in fact are going to bear the burden of this insane level of spending. I'm wondering if in a democratic system there's any hope for fiscal responsibility when it seems that everybody simply wants to go out and buy votes with as many promises as they can. The problem for those, I don't know, less inclined to think about economics is not necessarily the impact on the macroeconomy of this kind of fiscal approach. It's the impact on the government budget, where ever-increasing amounts of annual federal budgets go to interest payments, and smaller amounts of the federal budget are available for programs and so on. I'm wondering, where do you see this is going, and what party might have some approach to being fiscally responsible once they're in power?
Thank you, John. So I'll let each of the panelists have a crack at it, but I'm going to pass on the question. Malcolm?
Well, a wise woman once said, sooner or later you run out of other people's money. And that's what I think will happen. An argument I've been trying to make, to especially those on the right and the left, is that fiscal austerity actually is taken to support. I believe in fiscal austerity because I believe in the welfare state. There's a fabulous book written by Janice McKinnon about the NDP government in the mid-1990s, and that's exactly the point that she makes. I don't know what's going to happen, and I think governments are going to keep spending until they run out of money. There's a great scene in this book where Janice McKinnon and the Premier are waiting by the phone, and they're waiting for the bonds to sell on Wall Street, where they literally were running out. They could not get money from, they were dependent on Wall Street bankers for money. And that'll happen to us, and it'll probably happen at the provincial level sooner, and then we'll have to restructure chaotically, and it will be very bad. So that's.
Yeah, so both the major parties, they're promising to run different levels of debt. The deficit will be quite different between the two parties. So if you're concerned about that, there's a kind of choice that you can make. But of course, both of them are planning on running a deficit. Of course, Malcolm is right. I mean, we know where this is going. It's going to an austerity election and eventually austerity. In 1993, the deficit was an actual salient issue. You had parties running against each other, trying to cut each other off by reducing the deficit to zero quicker and quicker and quicker. And after the in the early 1990s, we got full-on austerity under a Liberal government that had campaigned on the basis of jobs, jobs, jobs. So that's Jean Chrétien. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Instead, we got austerity. That is certainly coming. And it will, in the next election or the election after that, probably the debt and deficit will be the defining issue of the campaign, I would think.
Mary Agnes.
Just one last thought on that. The debt and the deficit is nowhere for voters. It's the kind of thing where in their brains, they know it's important, in their hearts, they don't care. And I'm speaking as somebody who isn't quite sure what productivity is, so take all this with a grain of salt. So, but I think one of the issues around that is how those fiscal issues are messaged by politicians. And government budgets are complicated things, not as complicated as they would have you believe, but complicated things. And I think both parties, perhaps the Tories in particular, who tend to talk about these issues more, have done a really bad job explaining why we should care and why we need to rein in some of that spending. When it's important to spend, as maybe now during COVID, and perhaps now it might be, and when we need to, Paul Martin that stuff. And so I think I'm fascinated to see if in the next couple of cycles we get better as a country talking about debt and deficits, because we're terrible at it right now. The public doesn't care. They got bigger things. They're worried about their own debt and deficits. It's really difficult to think sort of long term and no pain, no gain around some of those issues.
I recall Diefenbaker saying politicians aren't elected on issues of deficit or debt, and Alvin Hamilton broke off with Diefenbaker over that issue. But at the same time, I guess politicians have a different priority compared to the longer term dealing with financial management. And then when we hit a full-blown crisis like Brazil, then we're really in a lot of trouble. So I see Stan over there. Stan's the director of the Moral Institute for Peace and Justice. Stan, could you come over here, because I found out this wireless microphone cuts out a little bit if we're too far away from the base.
Sure. Thank you. Well, thank you, panelists. You know, when I was reflecting on what you said, Dr. Malcolm Bird, thanks be to Trump, sounded like I'm not to bury him, but to praise him. Yeah, surely, we needed, I believe you being sarcastic, and we needed a convicted felon, a bully of Canada and the world into his transactional version of his racist, protectionist, authoritarian, misogynist version of his Make America White Again agenda. I think we really need to pay attention to that. But at the same time, just to come back, that was just my statement, but I believe it was Pierre Trudeau, a liberal, many, many years ago, who cautioned and warned Canada to use the world as their hinterland and not to be dependent on the United States. I wonder what happened to Canadians who got so complacent with that relationship. And when I look at this election, especially after Carney came in, and especially after Donald Trump came into power, the context changed. And yet, I see Pierre Poilievre stuck with an old narrative and unable to change with the context while asking Canadians to change and asking them to vote for a change. So I wonder, to what extent does context play in the minds of those who choose to elect a new government?
Thank you, Stan. Who wants to handle this?
Well, I guess me. There's a great book by a former prime minister called Right Here, Right Now. Stephen Harper wrote this book. And he was really curious to know why Donald Trump won. And you characterized Mr. Trump using a bunch of adjectives that, whatever. But I believe in democracy, and clearly there's something that Mr. Trump appeals to people. And what he appeals to them is that he is appealing to generally working Americans who've been abandoned by the right and also by the left. So I think he's a legitimate leader here. I am absolutely astonished that the resistance to the global capitalist order is coming from the American Republican Party. I was listening to a talk yesterday, a few days ago, where the Republican Treasury Secretary was responding to declines in the stock market. And his answer was 12% of the equities are owned by, 12% of the US population owns 88% of the equities. The other 40% or other 12% are owned by the other 40%, and the bottom 50% of Americans have debt. And I couldn't believe it. We have a US Republican Treasury Secretary talking about the gross material inequalities. I'm just going to leave it there. Mr. Trump is there because Americans want him to be there, whether Canadians like him or not, and he's acting in the interests of America because that's his job. I don't know how many Canadians I've gone into discussions with where I've had to remind them that that's a separate country and Donald Trump's job is not to look after Canada. That's our government's job. Anyway, I'm going to stop.
Royce, you want to go first?
Some of the responses to Canadians to the tariffs have been surprising. Like, my feelings are hurt. You are our friends. Well, maybe we ought not be surprised when other countries act in their own best interest and not in our best interest. It's not a huge surprise. You asked what we've been doing to prevent ourselves from treating the world as a hinterland, having markets outside of the United States. Well, we spent the last 10 years having debates about east-west pipelines that would have taken our energy products to markets other than the United States. That's what we've been doing. And now that we need those pipelines, now that the US market is closing itself off to us, we don't have them. And so, as Malcolm has said, these are debates that we probably should be having now, and Trump is forcing them upon us. I don't want to thank him, that'll hurt my future political career, but I think there's a real argument there, to be honest.
I was thinking a bit about something Malcolm said about how English Canada doesn't really have an identity. And I don't quite know if I'm going to get an answer to your question, but one of the things I've been surprised at, and maybe future political science research will not bear this out, but I really think about how much Donald Trump and sort of a Canadian debate about how much our politics is inching in that direction, shouldn't inch in that direction, has helped to sort of frame this election, and also made life really hard for Pierre Poilievre in many ways. And bear with me here, I think about the last provincial election and the debate over Search the Landfill, and the moment where billboards went up and that the Tories put up, we're not digging in the dump, and not a whole cadre, a slice of swing voters who had genuine questions about searching the landfill said, oh, but I don't want to be on that team. And kind of gently maybe turned their focus to Wabkanu, who was probably going to win anyway, but made that kind of a decisive wedge issue not in the Tories' favor. And I wonder if some of that is happening in Canada now for Pierre Poilievre. I might be a voter who has genuine questions about woke stuff and, LGBTQs, it's gone too far, and, I have real concerns about immigration, perhaps, and, and I really hated Trudeau. But I don't quite want to be in the Trump side of things, side of the ledger. And so now that I have Carney, oh, thank God, I have an option. And I think there's a cadre of voters that have maybe started to redefine Canadian conservatism in a little bit more of a centrist way, and also perhaps started us thinking about what it truly means to be Canadian, and can we find a conservative, party that maybe better represents that more centrist view. Just a thought.
So I'm just going to take it over a little bit to another area, but slightly related, and my question is to Mary Agnes Welch. We all know that polling data in some ways missed some of the Trump supporters. These weren't shy Trump voters, these were people who just underrepresented the sampling. Is there a possibility that the sort of the lower educated, frustrated voters that were missed or underrepresented in the American sampling, could some of that be happening with Poilievre, and could some of the national sampling in Canada be missing some quiet support for Poilievre that might suddenly appear in this election?
I think the short answer to that is yes. We always worry about undersampling and just simply not reaching kind of lower education men, truly, often rural men. Those folks are going to vote, I think, overwhelmingly for Poilievre. And so when I look at the sort of the vote tallies among decided voters, in my head I always add a couple points to the Tories, and maybe take a point off the Liberal vote. I think the Liberal vote is softer, and I think that Tory vote we're probably underestimating it a little bit. And I think that's a function of sampling and polling. We try to correct for it, we try to wait for it, but I'm always worried that we're missing some of those folks, especially men, who will never take a survey from me or anyone else.
Thanks. I see a couple of questions. Okay, I'll go to this.
meet you over here. Okay, so we will have to get a little bit closer that way.
Is that political science?
Let's just be sure. I feel like
As a variety.
They already released the shirt.
Oh.
Students did it.
Okay.
All right, hi, my name is Ethan. I'm a master's student here in the Political Studies Department. I had a question about what the panel thinks about the role of policy in this election is. I thought that it was kind of, the two main parties are coming really close together on what the main policy issues are. Like the first thing that we saw was Carney axed the tax. He took the main piece of ammunition from the Conservative Party, and that was his first big thing. The parties are Conservatives and the Liberals seem to be in agreement as to how they're going to deal with Donald Trump. They're in agreement as to how they're going to deal with taxes. They're going to continue doing a lot of spending. So it seems a little bit odd to me that they're coming so close together, and yet we're seeing kind of this big shift in between where the Liberals and the Conservatives, or I guess more so the Liberals, are how they're performing in the polls. Is it more so to do with the leader's identity? Is it more so to do with something at the local level? How is policy playing, or isn't really playing a role in this election?
So we know that for Canadians, the number one priority is not Trump, it's not tariffs, it's cost of living, it's inflation, it's the sort of issues that Poilievre is actually strong on. That hasn't really been the focus that we've seen in general in the media, or you would expect that, given when Donald Trump is on the news every second day, threatening Canada, threatening to turn us into the 51st state. That's what people are going to focus on. It's certainly helped Carney, it's certainly helped the Liberals. And then as Trump receded from view, all of a sudden we've started to see this little bit of a correction. The Tories have inched up in the polls as there's been more of an opportunity for Poilievre to focus on issues like inflation that don't have to do with Trump, don't have to do with tariffs. Now, the question I always had was, is Trump going to be like a jack in the box, bounce up before election day and remind everyone why they were going to vote for the Liberals to start with? But yeah, I guess we have seen a lot of convergence on important issues that should separate the parties. It's a weird election. It's probably the first election focused on the Americans that most of us will have seen. The last one was 1988 when I was like 9 years old. And so there's reasons to expect the parties to converge on a lot of these other issues. Great question.
Yeah, great question. Sadly, a lot of elections aren't decided on policy at all. My big concern is I really hope that I train civil servants, and I really hope that they're able to fearlessly advise. And I hope that people in the finance department are telling the minister what he or she doesn't want to hear. With the carbon tax, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but it's really amazing how that just simply evaporated. I actually support the carbon tax, largely because I think we're really wasteful with energy, and I think if we used energy more efficiently, we'd have more higher productivity. I'll explain to Mary Agnes what that means in a bit. But I mean, it is amazing how such a big piece of policy on the environment front, on the productivity front, just has evaporated and done great damage, I think, to the climate change movement. You've seen that with the NDP, et cetera, et cetera. So my short answer is not enough.
Just very quickly, I think one of the interesting features of this election is how, I think in past elections, and I think you see this particularly provincially, but definitely federally, policy tends to be micro-targeted. It's this tiny announcement that speaks to this little segment of women who live in these kinds of ridings, 18 to 34, to move that vote in a really targeted way. I think what's interesting about this election is both big parties are just throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. The Liberals had barely any plan for this election. They never thought they were going to be here. And they have a brand new leader with his own ideas. They're making policy up on the fly, and not much of it, frankly. The Tories had a bunch of policies they thought they could roll out, none of which are sticking. They've had to recalibrate really quickly. The Tories are really good at that micro-targeting, and I've tended to see them do these broad, like, 3 strikes you're out, let's try that kind of announcements. Mandatory minimums, how about that? People kind of understand that without a lot of depth, because I think both the big parties, are just struggling to figure out what might stick in a broad way. Forget the micro-targeting, it's all gone to pot. It's these kind of big things, and none of them, cost of living stuff a little bit, but none of them, I think, is really eclipsing that question of, like, who is the right person to get us through this? This being Trump, and also cost of living stuff as well, I think, yeah.
Just one observation is that, you think about the previous election, O'Toole kind of switching things on the gun laws, and suddenly that was unraveling things for O'Toole. We aren't hearing the big particular platform issues this time around that we were before. I don't know if the Conservatives have come out with their platform. I know they hadn't on the weekend. The other parties had it. This morning, okay, thanks, Ron. Now there's another question.
Hi, thanks. My name's Steve. I teach politics in our department here. So I want to try a different hypothesis on you to explain why the polling has changed the way it has in the last couple of months. 99% chance of the Conservative majority, things are more or less flipping out. It's not about party systems, it's not about geopolitics, it's not about messaging. Poilievre is an a-hole. He was, for the electorate, right, in between elections, low information voters, they don't know him, they know Trudeau, they hate Trudeau, then Trudeau's gone. And now the campaign is firing on all cylinders, and Poilievre's out there saying the things that he's saying, sort of Trump-like kind of thing. And it's just not landing. It doesn't matter about the platform, it doesn't matter about the message, it's the messenger. And I think in any other leadership race with a different Conservative candidate, it's over, the Liberals are done. Because the problem is not the brand, the problem is the guy. So, why am I wrong?
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Great question. I don't want to be like Corey tonight. I don't want to second guess the campaign, but I do think one mistake the Tories made is that they didn't really show us much about Poilievre before this campaign started. Very effective opposition leader. He's aggressive, antagonistic, but it wasn't until, so I like to pretend I know a lot about these people. It was a week ago I found out that Poilievre and his wife, they have a daughter who has special needs, 6 or 7 years old, and is non-verbal. How did I not know that? And he's talking about it, he's talking about his background, he was adopted. Very interesting, sympathetic story. How on earth did I not hear about these things a year ago or 2 years ago? And so I think there was also something interesting in the English language debate. Abacus did one of their instant polls, and they, who do you think, who made you more likely to vote for them? And they asked that of people who watched a little of the debate and then they watched the whole debate. People that watched the whole debate were more likely to vote for Poilievre. People that just watched a little were more likely to vote for Carney. The more that they saw of Poilievre, the more they liked him. And so I would have been showcasing this different side of him, this softer side of him, the opposition leader, the aggressiveness. They've got that covered. They should have been doing something else. The other thing is that in conservative politics, winning elections is only half the game. Leaders have to hold onto the leadership. And the way you do that is by being right-wing, by throwing meat to the base, by being aggressive and question period. Poilievre is very good at that. And so people say, well, why isn't he moving to the center? Why isn't he becoming a centrist? Well, you can't really do that to any great extent, as Aaron O'Toole found out in the last election.
Yeah, no, good point. I always listen to what my wife has to say, a 57-year-old urban woman, educated, and she watched the debate and said, wow, it's the first time I've seen Mr. Poilievre as being leadership-like, statesman-like, all of those things. I didn't ask my wife who she voted for, but clearly that's an issue there. Yeah, So I think there's a strategic error there, as Royce pointed out.
Yeah, totally agree. Nothing else to add. Yeah.
Yes. Is that a New York Mets national? That's
Hi everybody, my name is Brent. I'm a political or soon-to-be political science student here at U of M as well. And since Ethan didn't take the opportunity, I'm going to take Professor Koop up on his offer from earlier to discuss the future of the party system, and then maybe just the future of where we see different political concerns across Canada. I just want to highlight maybe a few things. You don't have to speak to them, but one is the role of federalism. And this goes to the Indigenous point made earlier, the fact that when we have large projects that have to be national in scope, they have to also consider Indigenous consent and buy-in as well. This is an issue, I think, with provincial politics, and how is this going to look in the future, the relationship between the provinces and the federal government. And it's really interesting to see the role of Ford in Ontario and Smith in Alberta just through this process. The other thing is realignment. Dr. Birdie mentioned about young people moving to the Conservatives, and specifically young men is how I understand it. And it's, Professor Koop, you've also mentioned materialist and post-materialist concerns. Seems to be that there's also an element of cultural conservatism that's kind of is drawing attention to this particular portion of the electorate. So I just wonder what you think that might, how that might look in the future.
Thanks very much.
Chris?
All right, you go first.
Yeah, for cultural conservatism, I guess you maybe mean like anti-immigration kind of stances. Yeah, it's of course young men are going to be affected by if you're trying to break into the job market, and the job market is lots of temporary foreign workers, you're going to be affected by that. So that part of the population is going to be more affected by liberal immigration policies over the last 10 years. It's actually been very interesting seeing how the parties all, speaking of convergence, they all convert. They were all pro-immigration parties, and they all switched their positions. They seemed to move in unison. There was really, the Conservatives weren't ahead of the Liberals. The Conservatives were waiting for the Liberals to move on this issue, and then they turned on it. And for young men, young, relatively uneducated, primarily rural men, I'm not sure that cultural conservatism is going to make a big difference. I think that it's not going to be much of a motivating factor because the mainstream, the parties have all moved on this issue in the same way. Unless you're thinking about something else when you say cultural conservatism. Family issues haven't really been a big motivator. I think it is really economic concerns that are driving a lot of this. I could be wrong. I mean, I'm still getting used to the idea of the Conservative Party of the young. That's a brand new thing to me.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess federalism, I think, is actually in big trouble. I think our country is fracturing along, Western Quebec type lines. Although I'm happy to see more Canadian flags. In terms of like Indigenous, I think in terms of like big projects, I think the real key is to have Indigenous peoples participate in these. And share in the wealth and the jobs and all of this. I think there's a big division within Indigenous communities over sort of pro and not supportive of develop, resource-based projects. My feeling is that there's actually more support for them than possible, than opposition. And of course, just touching on the man issue, resource extraction, construction, like that's where there's good jobs. For young people, young men, and so I think that's the key, and I think we're going to see more of that in the future. But just generally with young men, I think men aren't really doing that well these days. You know, I mean, I get sort of criticized. If you look at alcohol rates, depression rates, suicide rates, gambling rates, overdose rates, university attendance rates, et cetera, et cetera. They're not looking very incarceration rates for men. You know, men are facing a lot of real challenges, and there is absolutely no sympathy or empathy for them and the challenges they're facing. So there you go.
I don't know that I have anything brilliant to add. Yeah. I'm thinking about the federalism thing, but I don't have thoughts just yet. Yeah.
Just on the federalism, I'll just have one observation, not so much to the question, but an observation is that we've seen with the Trump phenomena a shift from the federal government taking the lead and the provinces not taking the lead. We see Doug Ford and Alberta's premier and Walt Canoe has opened up an office down in Washington, D.C. I think we're seeing something, in fact, of the provinces have stepped up where there was a power vacuum last year on the U.S.-Canada relationship, and I'm wondering if that jack in the box can be put back in. I'm going to do one more question, and I know Susan Ducharme from the Peace and Conflict Studies program, she said she had a few, so she gets to pull out of her bat utility belt one more question. Here, come closer to the wireless.
Thank you. So my next question is about women's rights. And we hear about what's going on in the States. There's a lot of women's rights being revoked, right to reproductive rights and abortion. What do you see, especially with main parties that are running, do you see any of them doing the same thing here, taking away women's right to abortion, other women's rights?
Thanks, Susan. So, who wants to take this first, please? Malcolm?
No. You know, I don't think anyone's going to touch that. The Tories have said it over and over and over and over and over again. So, no.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, agreed. And I think that might be one of those issues where that contrast between our approach as Canadians to the Trump approach and the approach in the States has been, we're not going there. I think that's one of those issues. Royce? Yeah?
Yes. Yeah, and abortion politics can play a role in inter-party races and nomination races, in leadership races, and in smaller parties and provinces, but I don't see it being something that any party, certainly not the federal Conservative Party, is going to act upon. It's kind of a cross-cutting cleavage. If you exploit it, it wrecks your own party. It's like driving too fast in first gear. And so I wouldn't accept that. It's not that we should always take party leaders at their word. I think there's just good reason to expect that he's not going to act on
I think where there's a difference is once in power, what will the Conservatives do for certain organizations, cutting back on certain areas. We do know the Liberals have been much more pro-choice with Justin Trudeau, and that's affected certain policies and procedures with funding and things like that. But I don't see a major change in what the parties are doing. I do want to wrap up here, and I want to do a plug here for an upcoming book in the fall with Kelly Saunders, and I'm giving a plug for a book that we co-edited called Keystone Province, Politics and Governance in Manitoba. And the reason I feel that I can do this is that the four people on this table are each contributors to that book. And Mary Agnes Welch did a chapter with Curtis Brown on media and polling in Manitoba politics. Malcolm Bird wrote a very good chapter on Crown. Oh, yours was good too, Mary Agnes. Malcolm Bird did a chapter on Crown corporations in Manitoba. And Royce Koop did a chapter on the Progressive Party of Manitoba, and I did a chapter on the NDP history and the Legislative Assembly. So that book's coming out, and if you want to be at that book launch, send me an email and I'll send you a invitation when it comes out. Anita Neville, the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba, suggested we have the book launch at Government House. So I think that would be very nice in the fall. The other thing I want to mention is that I very much appreciate Rogers TV being here. Lacey has been here at the camera filming us, and this will be broadcast later on before the election date. And I do thank Rogers TV for being here and covering this event. And I want to thank all of our panelists and you, the audience, for being here.